You're welcome back. This is NewsFile, it's your most authoritative news analysis platform. And here on NewsFile, we put Ghana first. As I announced to you, my guest this morning, Bright Simmons, Honorary Executive Imani Africa, Dr. Yao Graham, Coordinator Third World Network, Dr. Abdul Basit Aziz Bamba, who is Senior Lecturer, University of Ghana Law School, Andrew Agyapa Mensah, MP Second D and Vice Chair, Communications Committee of Parliament, and Professor HKC PREMPEH, Executive Director of the CDD. They will all be joining us for this discussion. But last week, this is where we ended with Bright Simmons and Dr. Yao Graham. So Bright Simmons, you said, as your concluding remarks and what was most important to you, you said, if we decide that we want to maximize our returns to gold, the place to look is not in royalties. Royalties is almost risk-free. This year, we may hit $300 million in royalties. Anybody who tells you that Agyapa is a brilliant deal because we will get $500 million upfront to go and invest in development projects doesn't understand the industry. In 2 years, we will make what we are going to make upfront. So we do not need Agyapa. Agyapa does not only fail the corruption risk test, it also fails the national interest and national economic interest test. Now, my question to you is about this last bit of what you had to say about solutions. Yes. You said, where we don't make money and need to create a vehicle to maximize is the equity. That's what you didn't have the opportunity to expand on. So can we begin on that note? What exactly do you mean?
So when you look at our gold industry, sometime in the 70s, a decision was made to increase the national stake in our industries, our gold industries. So most of you who follow the economic history in this country knows that the Champon regime stepped up ownership stakes. And then in time, some evidence began to emerge that we were having difficulties raising capital for investment. So we were underproducing. And I'm sure you remember the famous Ashanti Gold deals with IFC in the late 80s that restored capitalization of the mining industry. So given that history, it appeared as if we become increasingly friendly to government, the reduction of government stake in the mining sector because of that history. And in time, we came to a situation where roughly 10% of every mine has to be owned by the state. It's not that, except in the case of bauxite and a few others. I think in industrial minerals, a different regime prevails. But certainly in gold, roughly 10% equity is the current situation. So the government automatically, because the minerals are vested in the president in trust for the people, if you are given a lease, the entity that you put together to mine the gold, 10% of that entity has to be owned by the state. Of course, like everything in Ghana and perhaps everything in the world, there are strange exceptions. So we know that somebody decided to have a very interesting arrangement with Ashanti Gold, where we were told we needed to get our shares in the parent company instead of the local company. And that was somehow beneficial to the country. Unfortunately, it was not the case. And now we have, what, 0.01% or something in Ashanti Gold International. And when you do the analysis, you come to the conclusion that we were making more from the combination of royalties and share of bullion from Ashanti Gold in the mid-90s, maybe 5 to 7 times more in the mid-90s than what we are making today. So we have a history of abject mismanagement of mineral resources in this country. A lot of the decisions that have been made are pathetic, to be extremely charitable. So in that context, the question then arises of the different types of returns from minerals that the state is entitled to. Rents, royalties, dividends through ownership of equity and the rest. Which one requires innovation. Royalties are fairly simple. Regardless of whether or not the mine makes a profit, we get our money. It's between 3% and 5%. And that scale itself was imposed on national policy by the mines and their lobbyists. However, that is the current situation. If the price of gold is bad, we reduce the royalty. If the price of gold goes above $1,700, we hit the 5% bar. In times of good good pricing, 5% is a sensible number to use. So 5% of all the gold produced, right, it's royalty. Of course, there are some that argue that even royalties can be manipulated in different ways, and therefore we should go to rents. That's a different debate. I'm not going to go into that. But of all the categories of income that we can get from minerals, the one that is most immune to transfer mispricing, which is where the company that is supposed to pay various amounts to the government find ways to shift their highly costly activities to the Ghanaian entity and shift the less costly activities overseas, so that they appear to be making a loss locally, while through their international structures, they're actually making money. Royalties is much more immune because we say whether or not you are making profit or not, give us our 5%. So if you want to maximize royalty intake, your proper behavior should be how you spend the money. It's as simple as that. On the other hand, we've now got to a situation where of all the minerals, that money that comes from minerals, maybe 90% or more increasingly are just from royalties. Which then raises the question of this 10% equity we hold in companies, why are they not paying the dividends? So if there is a thorny problem to solve in minerals, it is that segment, the issue of how we maximize the returns to equity. And the arguments that have been made over a number of times have included the creating of a super company or super vehicle that has the maxil to make sure that representation in terms of board roles and things like that are stronger. So that the government, for instance, is able to exert within these companies enough management pressure to ensure that we get paid. There are issues to do with, obviously, poor auditing. So I was just recently being told that if you go to the mines and you have these GRE officers that are supposed to make sure that their activities are properly auditable, some of them have been at the same mine for 13 years. And there are instances where it's quite clear that some of these people that are supposed to make sure that the volumes of gold that are being produced are properly audited have no clue what they are doing. They're highly under-incentivized. Their systems are not there. So we have big problems when it comes to auditability of how much gold is being produced and the costs.
Or they may be compromised.
That's a possibility. Then you have a situation also where when you look at the cost structure of gold, it becomes very difficult at that theoretical level to suggest any improvement, because sometimes shareholders are getting 1.5% and they are disclosing costs that suggest that maybe 60-something% of all costs are being spent in the country. So you look like, okay, maybe we are making enough already. Until you have to dig deep into it, then you realize that in actual fact, a lot of the purchases that are purported to be local are not sufficiently local in the way that they impact local value chains and things like that. So when you look at all of those things, we need increased presence in terms of management decision making in these mines. And a super vehicle might be able to attract the right people to do those things. In simple terms, royalties is not the place to look, because royalties are sufficiently risk-free that there isn't need for additional engineering of royalties. Where we have a problem is those places where we have 10% of a mine and we've not made money for many, many, many years. Look at bauxite. We discovered, for instance, that bauxite, consistently say the operation is unprofitable and there's nothing you can do about it. They just simply say, when they mine the bauxite, they don't make any money. So the 20% or so that we have in the bauxite regime is meaningless because they just claim they don't make money.
But is there not a difference? Here we are putting the royalties into a vehicle, a company, and hoping that this company will turn that money over and give us profit.
Okay. In that regard, if you think it's the $300 million that you can reinvest better, you have a MIF. You've changed the law in the MIF, which enables the MIF to set up an SPV, right? Today, without the JAPA, the MIF can set up a local SPV and say, what I want to put the $300 million a year that we get in gold is this. Let's discuss it. Because I'll make more money from this, and that. There's no need for any convoluted structure, because we know that money is fairly certain.
Okay.
The question that arises where you need innovative thinking is where the money appears not to be coming. You seem to have an asset. It's a liquid asset, right? Where we do financial engineering and financial innovation is when you have an illiquid asset and you want to make it more liquid.
Okay.
Not when you have a very liquid asset and you now want to go and turn it into a more speculative asset. I don't understand that logic.
Thank you very much. And I have to welcome Professor KWASI, PREMPEH Executive Director of the CDD-Ghana. He will shortly tell us of an area of what has happened that he seems to want to advocate, that perhaps we should begin this process of subjecting major contracts and deals by the state to a corruption risk analysis. Hi, Professor KWASI, PREMPEH.
Good morning, Samson.
Great to have you. So we'll come to you shortly. And also joining us is Dr. Abdul Basit Aziz Bamba, who is Senior Lecturer, University of Ghana Law School. Thanks for joining us, Doc.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Great. Now, Dr. Graham, last week you ended on this note. You said that, bottom line, that the giveaway terms, the poor evaluation, exclusion of public supervision, surrender of sovereignty, secrecy, opacity of being in a tax haven. So you simply quoted back to us what Amidu has said in the report. I take it again. The giveaway terms, the poor evaluation, the exclusion of public supervision, surrender of sovereignty, the secrecy, the opacity of the company being in a tax haven. None of those are cured by the President's directive to return the deal to Parliament. It is barred from conception. It is dead in the water. That's it. We ended there?
No, we don't end it there. And just to modify your thing a little bit, those things that I said was in a way the summary,
right,
of what many people have said about the Agyapa deal. Some of the things that Bright just said, for example, fall into that same space. So the OSP report agreed with what people have been saying. That is an important part of its strength. Because this, somebody can accuse me of, say, don't mind this leftist. Okay? The OSP office is a public office set up by the state as an independent entity. The OSP report agrees with what the whole range of citizenry have been saying. And that is important because, you see, that thing connects back to something which gets lost. The public ownership, the common ownership of our non-renewable resources by the citizens of Ghana, and the responsibility of government as a trustee for managing those things properly for us as the beneficial owners, which in practice has become executive control and ownership. And we are simply supposed to go along with whatever decision they make. That issue has been put very much sharply in view by this. And it's been in view in many ways. Some of the things talked about, for example, about the abject management. There are many aspects of it. Okay? So I'm simply repeating the fact that given this consensus which has emerged, including in the OSP's report, really, if the president is acting as a proper trustee for the beneficial owners, who are the people of this country, we can't proceed. Even with this thing, it is not in the interest of the people of this country. That's the consensus. I've not heard anybody outside die-hard loyalists or people close to the deal coming out to defend it. The points made also about the role of Parliament, which goes again to a failure of oversight on behalf of the people, adds to this thing about a kind of political elite consensus about managing our resources. In this case, actually, primarily not even in their own interest. In general, foreign companies and their shareholders have been the main beneficiaries of our resources. And one of the things which has been clear since the commodities boom is how all the contracts that have been signed across the continent, their terms are so poor that we don't even get the returns that we should be getting. Okay, and the point is Brian made of how that, I mean, we don't need a speculative vehicle for managing our royalties. So those things just confirm those things.
You say it is barred from conception.
Yes.
It is dead in the water.
Yes.
The president's directive is that after he had seen the report, he also asked the finance minister to also bring his response, which is a confidential memo. And he said the president has authorized to be made public that report, also the memorandum, to contribute to the national discourse on the matter, meaning there is supposed to be further discourse to contribute to the national discourse on the matter. He commended the special prosecutor. Then he says he welcomes this novelty of institutionalizing the risk of corruption and anti-corruption risk assessment, and wholly welcomes it as an important preventive weapon in the fight against corruption. He has instructed the minister that in the interest of transparency and accountability to the Ghanaian people, the agreements supporting the transaction that were submitted to Parliament and approved by the House should be resubmitted to Parliament for the approval process to start all over again. You say what? This shouldn't happen?
No, I'm saying that that proposal by the president really doesn't stand up if in the context of the totality of the conclusions of the OSP report. It doesn't stand up in the face of the consensus that the OSP report finds with all the technical, economic, process criticisms that have been made of the Agyapa deal. So if the president is acting in the interest of the beneficial owners of this resource, why does he want to persist with something which has been found to be flawed in so many aspects? So even though the president has directed, it is our right and responsibility, first as the beneficial owners, the citizens, okay, and also also who have an interest in this case, to analyze the president's reaction, to find out whether really it's a reaction which has legs.
The CSOs.
He may have the power to direct. That's his power. But it is possible to conclude that the president's proposals don't have legs in the light of everything that has been said.
The CSOs, particularly those in the extractive industry, where that's your comfort zone. Martin Amidu says you are such a key stakeholder. You have complained earlier about secrecy, opacity, and lack of consultation. What else do you want the president to do? He says, let's allow the opportunity. Let's start afresh. You have complained about procurement issues. He says that he has directed that the procurement of the services of the transaction advisor or advisors should also be reviewed by the Ministry of Finance and the Attorney General with the aim of taking all steps that may be necessary to remove any doubts about the integrity of the process. And then these are his expectations, that the transaction advisors, together with the Ministry of Finance and the Minerals and Investment Fund, will use this opportunity to also amend the relevant agreements to take into account the useful feedback received during the series of stakeholder consultations over the last months. What else do you want the president to do?
Samson, if you take the totality of the president's comments, what is going back to Parliament? That's the point.
Everything.
No, but it means that there's a whole range of things which have to be done afresh. If you take the totality of the president's comments to accept that this thing is so flawed, And the only conclusion that he could come to without losing face, or no, let me put it this way, to avoid losing face, he doesn't come to the only obvious conclusion that can come from even the proposal that he said. Because proposals, in a way, are accepting that all the criticisms that have been made are substantial. And the CSO thing is not simply a process criticism. The process criticism fits into the substantive criticism about the merits of the Agyapa deal. Its merits, not simply because certain things were not done, but its merits. And the questioning of the merits have been expressed in different ways by different people, whether it's about the valuation, whether it's about tax haven, whether it's about opacity, whether it's all kinds of things. The president is saying, take on board all these things. What is left then of the Agyapa deal? The conclusion, which he's unable to draw, understandably, because it is his government which has put this thing forward, is that this thing really, it doesn't measure up. It does not measure up.
The finance minister was on this platform. Yes. I asked him the question, yes, what was going to happen to it. He said, there's no going back.
But he, of course, he would persist, because they are the drivers of this deal. They are the drivers of this deal. And this is one of the unfortunate problems of our politics.
Right.
A refusal to admit that we are wrong, and a persistence in using power in a way that even if it's not in the interest of the country. Because the beneficiaries of that deal, ultimately, we know from everything that's been said, will not be primarily the people of this country, but some other entities, known and unknown, politically connected or not.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let me go to Professor H.K.C. PREMPEH, and once we are done with him, we'll have Dr. Abdul Basit Aziz Bamba also share with us from where he sits as a lawyer. Both the NDC and the CSOs are calling for first, and I understand, let me correct myself, earlier I said it was the NDC asking for investigations before prosecution, but the CSOs were asking straight away for prosecution. The CSOs are also asking for investigations before prosecution. So he will tell us whether or not that sits well with the mandate of the special prosecutor as presently, activated to do this process on the back of what Professor H.K.C. PREMPEH is advocating for. Now, Professor H.K.C. PREMPEH, the special prosecutor in the last but one paragraph of the report says that this analysis of risk of corruption and anti-corruption assessment was undertaken pursuant to Section 2C. We know that Section 2C of the OSP Act gives the OSP a three-tier mandate. The mandate number one is to prosecute, investigate, and prosecute corruption. Mandate number two is to recover. And mandate number three is prevention of corruption, which is a novelty, so that we know that you guys were very happy and excited about this other leg of the mandate, so that we don't get the money stolen or dissipated and then we chase after the wind. He says, and Section 4, 29, 26, and 73 of the Office of the Special Prosecutor Act and Regulation 31 of the Office of the Special Prosecutor Operations Regulations, and in fulfillment of the mandate of the office to undertake measures to prevent corruption, which includes the analysis of the risk of corruption, anti-corruption assessment of legislation and draft legislation, publicizing detected acts of corruption, identifying deficiencies in administration of instructions, regulations and procedure, and individual interest, including greed, lack of ethicalness, and legal awareness, among others. This office accordingly hopes that the foregoing analysis of the risk of corruption and anti-corruption assessment of the processes leading up to the parliamentary approval of the transaction documents will be reviewed in good faith and used to improve current and future legislative and executive actions to make corruption and corruption-related offenses very high-risk enterprise in Ghana. You commend this, and you say we need to think about subjecting major deals like this to such a process before we undertake it. Can you explain your position?
Sure. Thank you, Samson, for the opportunity. So I think historically, certainly in the Fourth Republic, or when we have had constitutional government, we have put all of our anti-corruption eggs in one basket, which is the prosecution basket. So we have spent, resources on prosecutorial bodies and various law enforcement agencies, where the whole purpose of fighting corruption has been to detect it, investigate it, charge culprits if you can find them, gather evidence, launch prosecution, and hopefully get a conviction. If you look historically at the returns on that kind of investment, certainly in Ghana, no one has to really tell you that we've had very little payoff from that approach to fighting corruption. And there are a number of reasons for that. It's really, there are so many steps along the way, not all of which is controlled by one entity. So who does the investigation, the detection often is different from the prosecutor, who does the charging, the police. So there are many, many different entities along the line. And of course, it ends up in the judiciary, which is also not within the control. So at any one point, somebody can drop the ball. And the processes are also somewhat politically mediated at different points. Even if you have a different OSP, you have the police, that's different. You have investigators, you have all of that. And then you have the judiciary. So essentially, we haven't really had a good return on our investment from that approach to fighting corruption. And so a number of us have advocated, that we really need to just expand the number of tools in our toolkit for fighting corruption. And rather than fight corruption in the backward-looking way, which is the way we've been doing it, wait for the corruption to happen and then go try and unravel it and find it out. We should also be trying to prevent corruption. And I think this tool comes in handy. The reason I like it, and I think the reason a number of us like it, it has an analogy or precedent in the environmental impact assessments, or the idea of environmental risk assessments. The idea that before, normally, unless, you really attend to the environment, give it real focus or attention, one is unlikely to factor it into one's thinking when one is undertaking a project. So the idea of an environmental risk assessment is to force decision makers to actually think about how a proposed project will impact the environment in multiple ways, the ecology, the community, all of those things. And then to issue a report, do an assessment, and if the proposal does not pass a certain test, then you don't proceed with it. Or if the risk to the environment can be mitigated in a cost-efficient way, then those mitigation factors are then recommended, and then you can proceed only on condition you mitigate those factors. So that's the idea. And I think importing that idea into the corruption area is brilliant. It means that we don't have to wait for the house to burn down before we put a fire extinguisher in it. When a deal is proposed, or even when a piece of legislation, in fact, sometimes proposed constitutions have even been subjected to a corruption risk analysis. Because corruption, though we think of it as a crime, and that is where the prosecutorial stuff comes in, it's also, in a sense, a crime of opportunity. If there are ample opportunities created within a deal, within legislation, within a particular kind of proposal for corruption to occur, then the likelihood that corruption will occur is actually high, very high. So the idea here is that before you proceed with the project, before you proceed with a deal, before you proceed with even the law, you have an independent assessment of all the various ways in which corruption can't enter into the deal. So all the possible entry points, all the opportunities that are created in the deal for corruption to happen would then be looked at, and then a proposal will be made as to how those loopholes, those entry points, those possible leakages, those possible opportunities may be mitigated or closed. And a report then would form the basis upon which we will proceed or not proceed with the action. So it looks very much like we do with an environmental impact statement. I think the idea here is a brilliant one. And as you've actually mentioned, it falls within the mandate of the OSP. In fact, I think basically, we should probably spend more time on this part of the OSP's mandate than possibly on the prosecutorial part, because a lot of corruption is difficult to detect. Corruption is not something that happens with eyewitnesses present, except usually the participants.
That's right.
Who have every incentive to make it not come public, right? So really, the idea that you really are going to get a lot of corruption cases detected, it's actually, it's fanciful. Yeah. A lot of corruption will go undetected because it is not an activity that happens in the glare of the public. So in my view, we should be spending more of our resources on preventative tools. And this one, I think, is a brilliant one. The problem, though, is that I think, the OSP going this way is brilliant. However, I think prior to going this way, what I would have loved to see is a template developed that shows how it is, right? Like a form, a proper template with, different, disaggregated into its various parts, explaining exactly how this corruption risk assessment would look like, how it's going to be done, and so that there is clarity in advance on how the process works. So I think that, maybe this is just, the way it started, but I would prefer that we actually go back and develop a proper template that is actually, we all know it, it's publicized.
Beyond the template, Professor KWASI PREMPEH, beyond the template,
yes.
There are those who say, you see that this is the hand of the OSP himself, writing and using language that many media persons are even unable to decipher and therefore are not able to follow what is going on. Many people are attempting to read, and some have told me, even lawyers have told me how difficult it is for them to read it. You must be really determined to read this 64-page document before you can actually read it. And so the professional outlook doesn't come out that clean. He says his office is too small. He can't even employ people in there to work. Should we be looking at hiring accounts people, auditing personnel, staffing this particular section of that department of his office to do this work and do it well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is not a one profession kind of job. It is by its very nature interdisciplinary. Depending on the nature of the deal, you need to bring in a lot of other professionals, whether on staff or on a consulting basis. But you definitely do need to have a whole array of professionals who would look at this. Certainly accountants, certainly people who understand the finance world, depending on the deal that's at stake. And like I said, it's not just deals, it's even legislation. So it's not just a lawyerly task. And I think part of the difficulty people are having with the report, if you had a template, a predetermined, published template, then the discussion would be a lot more disciplined. It would be more systematic. The analysis would follow a more orderly pattern, a more systematic pattern, and then you could actually use it to greater profit. So I think part of the difficulty that many are having with the content of the report, it's the absence of this pre-organization or this template that would assist us to follow this in a systematic manner. So I think that basically that's what is lacking, and that's what we need to go back and do. I don't see this. It is not, So maybe this is where I have difficulty, because when you don't do it that way, it also, then people can't tell. If it reads through too loyally, it might look like, well, then go ahead and prosecute. I don't see this as a prosecution docket. It's not a docket for prosecution as such. What it is an assessment of the risk, the various sources of risk within a transaction, and how those sources of risk arose or have arisen, where those sources lie, and how we might mitigate them, if possible, to let the deal proceed. And if not, if they are so fundamentally flawed in the design, then you say, no, the deal cannot proceed on that basis.
Right. So the
virtue of this arrangement, and I think it would be to our benefit as a country if we could institutionalize it and make sure not just the OSP to do it, but actually mainstream it. This should be mainstreamed within MDAs, so that within each organization, the same way we would do for maybe like gender mainstreaming, or for mainstreaming any idea that is good, yet if left unattended to, left without particular focus, will not get done. Right. So I consider there's the same way we should be mainstreaming gender, the same way we should be mainstreaming environmental assessments. We should mainstream anti-corruption. It doesn't become the job of only the OSP. OSP might have ultimate oversight at some point, but the G could do that. It depends themselves.
Right.
That's how people.
So you just preempted my final question, but this is another part of that question. The first part of that question was about why people should be subjecting themselves to such a process when an assessment, as you say, is not intended for prosecution, will now open people up to criticism and all sorts of issues and calls for prosecution. What do you say to critics that will say this will be adding yet another bureaucracy to a layer of bureaucracy to the processes of procurement? As in, if you take away assessment of legislation and other things aside, and you are going to stall procurement. We already have procurement processes, we have procurement entities in every organization, and we are going to go through another process of having a corruption risk analysis. So what class of contracts or projects should go through this process?
Sure. I mean, it's not all procurement. I mean, not all bureaucracy is bad. If bureaucracy was bad inherently or ab initio, we would not have bureaucracy. I mean, there is good reason to have bureaucracy, and if it's cost justified, the issue is what is at stake here is what we have to look at. We are hemorrhaging huge resources, not just through corruption, through waste, through lack of diligence, and many other such omissions and acts of commissions. And so I don't think it is a good enough response to say that this is going to add to the layer of corruption. The question is, what benefit are we going to get out of it? What's the payoff? What's the return on investment? And I think that given the way where the country loses money through diligence, through corruption, through waste, this is money, this is time well spent. If we're going to spend a little bit more time to get more diligent so that we identify the sources of conflicts of interest likely to lead to corruption. We identify lapses in procurement that are likely to invite corruption. We identify these things. We identify discretion that is so unbounded that, in fact, there's almost a formula for this. There's something that's been developed, like, corruption happens when there's a lack of transparency, there's too much discretion, there's monopoly of power. All of these things are there. You can actually break them down and analyze them that way. I don't think it's a good enough response, given where we are as a country, to say that this will add to the layer of bureaucracy. There are a lot of layers of bureaucracy we don't need. This is not one of them. This is a useful one. And to the last point is, yes, we need to sit down and identify the thresholds. What's an appropriate threshold to set for when we have to do this kind of a deal? Of course, you have to be also mindful of the fact that sometimes if you set, people can play tricks with these things. You can set a threshold and say 5 million, transaction above 1 million. And then you might have somebody break the same transaction down into 5 small.
You know, Professor PREMPEH, you know what you just reminded me of? The National Lotteries procurement, the Ram's Kitchen procurement matter, where because the threshold is 100,000, and he broke down the contracts into, if you like, 99 up to 11 separate contracts.
Yes, this will happen. You know, and it happens in many other places. I mean, you look, you know, when you set thresholds, you have to take these things into account.
Okay.
So let's have to step back, be systematic about it, not rush it, but use this as an opportunity to start a real conversation about what additional tools that in our toolkits to fight corruption. It's not always about prosecution.
Okay.
The prosecution, in my view, is too after the fact, and our record on it in terms of success is too poor. To put too much eggs in that basket. Okay.
Thank you so very much, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, for your time with us this morning.
Welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh is the Executive Director of the CDD-Ghana. Of course, you have known him as an anti-corruption crusader, also good governance, you know, analyst or advocate, and a constitutional lawyer as well. Also, that is his point there, very instructive for all of us. Now we are going to Dr. Bamba on the question of prosecute, or investigate and prosecute. He'll give us a legal perspective. But before we do that, let's have Bright and Dr. Yaw Graham give us their brief, you know, a comment on the back of the proposal or the advocacy as started by Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, and I've seen Dr. Theo Champong, Professor KWASI, all supporting that this is a good thing, so that we preempt and not wait for the money to be lost and then we go chasing after it. We don't find it. You jail a person, you have jailed an individual, the money is gone. Yes.
No, I mean, Professor Prempeh is very usually thoughtful and comprehensive views on these matters, always has my respect. However, I'm concerned about whether or not the good faith aspect of these bureaucratic and political actions make any technical solution possible. I've been doing this now for a decade and a half, and I'm slowly coming to the conclusion that where the value system is so broken to the point where people don't set out making a good faith effort to comply, it becomes almost impossible to use technical means. If we look at and I don't know whether this is where you want me to validate my points, you want to go around and come back again, but if you look at what has happened in the Agyapa transaction, it is quite clear that someone very skilled has set out to circumvent the process, without doubt. And I am not sure that any technical measures, so to speak, will have been enough. If we had, as part of the framework for large transactions in this country involving the public sector, a preventive mechanism as advocated very eloquently by Professor Prempeh, my view is that they will have set up certain other mechanisms to override it. Okay. And let me give an example. When Agyapa started, and this point is not clear to many people, so I think you need to give me a little time to explain it because it's quite germane. When Agyapa started, it started off because the government claimed that it received unsolicited proposals over a certain period of time, pushing a very specific type of transaction. You have some gold coming in the future, we have money. Because the nature of these things is such that the price of gold fluctuates, the income has volatility. And in finance, wherever there is volatility, there's opportunity for profits. So because we see this volatility and we have a higher risk appetite than you do, we will give you the money upfront and benefit from the potential upswing. So let's say over the next 10 years, the gold that is going to come to you, you predict is $1 billion. We predict it's $300 million. That creates room for a $300 million upside. That is the nature of finance. So we will give you some money up front and we'll do this deal. The government then says about asking the Public Procurement Authority for permission to go ahead on any 6th October letter. Subsequently, the Public Procurement Authority writes to the government asking it for it to give it a list of names, when in fact, in its 6th October letter, it had already provided names. The government then submit a new set of names, and in between, in two correspondence and 2 pieces of correspondence in November, 2 things happened. The government placed the transaction into technical and financial. Some group is supposed to provide financial proposals. Another person or entity is supposed to provide a technical opinion on how to go forward. Somehow down the line, the initial decision to do a receivable-backed transaction or a securitization somehow disappears from the record. And now we have one situation where you have the government insist on some kind of local content provision, not in the Public Procurement Act, but which is not necessarily bad, and which will have happened post any corruption preventive assessment. Now, subsequently, they decide to then use this as a mechanism, give 17 days to potential respondents, which then bars 6 out of the 8 shortlisted entities from participating. And of the 2 that participate, they submit their responses on 8th January. So 17th December, we write to them and say, send in your details. 8th January, 2 of them respond. On 12th January, the bids are open. What is fascinating is that on that 12th of January, a technical report is written and signed. You understand what I'm saying? So 8th January, they present their response to the RFP. On 12th January, the technical committee sits. And on 12th January, for something as momentous and as important as monetizing future gold royalties into perpetuity, they proceed to approve, or rather to make a decision between Morgan Stanley and Imara the same day as it's opened. So the technical report is dated the same 12th of January that they opened the bids. What is more fascinating is that they make it quite clear, and I have checked and subsequently found it to be true, that this Imara corporate finance entity in Johannesburg, which is the one that actually submitted the bid, has only one person on its staff with true relevant experience. And somehow, it purports to have decided that this company is superior to Morgan Stanley, which more or less invented the first model for financial analysis in the world.
You spoke about subcontracting again to Morgan Stanley.
No, but this is different from the subcontract. That was to JP Morgan.
All right. Yeah, JP Morgan, okay.
So my point is, if good faith does not exist upfront, we will have difficulty continuing to invent more technical solutions. What is my alternative proposal then? I think we should go ahead definitely and implement more preventive steps.
Okay.
But at the same time, this country has to decide whether or not it wants to empower non-state actors to be more effective in playing a vigilance role. I bet you, without the vigilance of civil society, the opposition, and the rest of it, no technical measure, no bureaucracy, no mechanism will have stopped this.
Okay.
At least.
All right. Thank you.
It.
Yeah. And that's the sad commentary about our parliaments. And our parliaments over the years continue to disappoint everybody. We go shopping in saloons, we go shopping in non-existing places, and we have all sorts of bad deals on our hands. And yet when they get criticized for not doing the due diligence that they are put there to do, but rather doing blind political loyalty, rubber stamping things, they get disturbed. But you know what? This is our job. I have stopped doing the conveyor belt journalism long ago. If I have to continue to sit here, I'll do a journalism that is not conveyor belt journalism. Yes, so what would you say, what Prof. KWASI PREMPEH is proposing? And you see, he also talks about the fact that even when you do, people will find ways. So we should find threshold. And I was laughing about the threshold for public procurement and the story that came up about the national lotteries, where the chief executive had gotten his in-law to get a particular contract, but which if he had given it one go, it would not be qualified. So we had to break it down to 11 different, slots to give to her.
I mean, I think the KWASI PREMPEH's proposal, there's nothing to dispute about it. I want to pick some of the things that Bright has said. Interestingly, Bright, where you landed shows what a preventive thing can contribute. Because the things that you spoke about, those steps, that the way the deal shifted and this objective shifted, the qualities and so on. One of the things that the OSP report helps us to understand the maneuvers. So the stronger effectiveness of non-state actors definitely will be helped by these kinds of mechanisms.
But at what point will that preventive examination have been done?
No, let me come. I mean, there are many things that, many lessons about institutions and process that we can draw from the OSP report and what should be done, what can be done, what will be some of the challenges with using certain approaches. So that's what I'm trying to build.
But that was done midstream.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm saying that, but the preventive, the thing, so where in the sequence should certain things be done?
Exactly.
That's very important.
Okay.
And
we are fortunate to have passed a law in which we have introduced a novelty that instead of fighting corruption always after the act, after the event, let's be proactive and prevent it rather than allow it to happen.
So we are talking about how to improve the prevention.
Exactly.
I think that's what KWASI's thing.
Yes.
Bryce's thing is that there are some other factors which affect the effectiveness of the prevention. I don't think we can dispute that. But the point I'm making is that those factors are part of the political ecosystem. You make the point that non-state actors can reinforce the preventive thing. And I'm saying certain mechanisms, access to information early enough, those things can improve the quality of the prevention. And on the point about who trying to get around it, it is also possible, just like when they do an audit, something can look a particular way, but you can say, listen, this thing is not credible, and so on. So, but you put your finger on it, and that technical solutions alone are not enough. But I think we can also agree that the technical, institutional things and improved processes would help limit the possibilities. People continue to try to be clever and so on. But I also said that because this discussion really goes to the issue of when we talk about the state as a public factor, as something in the public interest, we are talking about its effectiveness, its efficiency, and its capabilities. And I think this thing about these mechanisms and so on, given what we know about the abuse of public office, which is increasingly in Ghana deemed to be one of the benefits of public office, we need to be able to do the things that don't make the thing a kind of post facto chase after corrupt returns.
Okay.
And the other thing also, which has been a major part of the discussion, is how do we improve, say, for example, the openness of the contracting process? So you combine a number of different things, and then it kind of makes it more difficult for people to do certain things. Just a last point about the prosecution. I mean, the point about the prosecution which was made by the CSOs is not an either-or thing. In fact, it is because the report itself talks about things which have gone wrong. So they were trying to make a risk assessment, but in the process, the OSP report comes to some conclusion that some things may have gone wrong already, which could be the basis for further, investigating and prosecuting. So if you look on page 22, 23, for example, the report says, let me read. This analysis of the risk of corruption and anti-corruption assessment of legislation and identified deficiencies in regulations and instructions and blah, 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 blah. It is therefore not intended to include any detailed analysis and assessment of those payments. It's referring to some payments that have been made. In this report, because of their nature, the proper place to deal with them is when these assessments give rise to a decision to open full investigations into the transaction documents for suspected corruption and corruption-related offenses.
Thank you. Dr. Abdul Basit, Aziz Basit Bamba, thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. So we'll deal with you, we'll have you deal with this question of the calls and demands for investigation and prosecution, and then we'll take a break to return to deal with the question of the OSP identifying, as he says, former President Mahama as government official 1, and stopping there literally and claiming that he has bought himself an insurance by being the flag bearer of the NDC, and therefore nothing can go on. Some people are really livid that you cannot make that claim, and that it's actually inconsistent with his own statements, because he says that crime should not have any color and so on and so forth, and yet he claims that he's found somebody to be committing a crime and yet does not intend to take any further step or will only take a step until something else has happened. Do we have Dr. Bamba on the line? Great, great. So the civil society group, which is made of, a coalition of groups in the extractive industry, did a press conference and said a number of things. I'm sure we can hear Dr. Steve MANTEAW briefly on that. And then the NDC also had a few things to say about prosecution. Then we'll have you address the legal question on that.
While we commend the President for acting on the report, we hold the view that the specific course of action directed by the President is inadequate and not sustainable. A proper reading of the report of the OSP should lead to two conclusions. One, that the deal is defective beyond repair. Two, that there are potential breaches of various laws, Public Procurement Act and the Public Financial Management Act. Furthermore, the range of steps that the President has asked the Minister of Finance to take to repair the defects in the Agyapa transaction objectively amount to there being deep-seated fundamental flaws. Whether we support the call for the dismissal of the Finance Minister, I would like to refer you to the statement that I've just read, which encourages a special prosecutor to go the next level of properly investigating the matter and indicting all those officials who may have been implicated in any wrongdoing and maybe taking them through the court processes. It is only when a court of competent jurisdiction has found them guilty that we can now, on the basis of that ruling, begin to call for certain actions. That has to do with the reference to the Airbus scandal in the Agyapa report. That was unfortunate. I would have wished that hadn't happened. It takes the shine of the report. Perhaps the special prosecutor could have avoided that.
Right. So Steve MANTEAW spoke, Dr. Steve MANTEAW spoke for the CSOs in the extractive industry who came together and who have from, the inception been speaking up very, loudly about aspects of the deal that they are against. So the NDC also joined, issued a press release, and actually it was read also by Dr. Johnson Esiedunketia, the General Secretary. The 5-page press release, among others, says that the Special Prosecutor's report has just confirmed, and I read just a portion. They say it's a clear case of a nepotistic thievery, and then say that the NDC and several patriotic civil society organizations such as Imani, ISODEC, PEAC, Acapa, the Ghana Integrity Initiative, IDEG, and the Coalition of CSOs on the Extractive Sector, among several others, have long maintained that the Agyapa deal is a bad deal for Ghana, and that it was only a matter of time for the stench from this criminal enterprise called Agyapa to become obvious to all. They called it or labeled it daylight robbery. They labeled it a scam. They said it was in furtherance of the thing of state capture, the agenda of state capture that they have accused the Akufo-Addo administration of, that it vindicates the minorities' boycott of the approval of the deal, and the NDC's promise that if it's had the opportunity of being returned to power in the elections, it will abrogate the whole thing. Now, it ended by threatening series of actions, including suits and protests, if, as it says, and I read in paragraph 12 of their statement, the OSP must conduct criminal investigations into this matter and ensure that anyone who directly or indirectly played a role in the Agyapa scam faces the full rigors of the law. And then concludes by saying, they hereby demand that President Akufo-Addo retrieves for the state the billions of cedis his government has illegally paid under the shady Agyapa deal to data bank. Billions of cedis. Okay, I'll need someone to help us here. And Bright, take note of this. Have we spent billions of cedis on this already? A deal to Agyapa, to data bank, which is owned by his cousin and finance minister Kenneth Oriata, Africa Legal Associates, which is owned by another cousin of his, Gabi Asare-Tredako, and their foreign compradors. Within the next 7 days, failing which the NDC and other like-minded progressive forces shall embark on a series of protests and legal actions to ensure that every peswa paid to these companies are refunded back to the state for nation building. Dr. Bassett, investigate and prosecute. How do we proceed in this way in a corruption risk assessment, which is a novel and very good thing to prevent corruption, and we are in a hurry to call for investigation and prosecution, and yet we think this is very good going into the future in government procurements of significant, which involve significant national resources?
Thank you so much, Samson. Before I answer your question directly, it's important perhaps maybe I refer to our Constitution, particularly Article 35(8), which makes it very clear that the state has a duty and must take steps to eradicate corruption. Now, Constitution makes so many references to corruption. Apart from Article 35(8), a reference to corruption, a greater part of the mandate of SHRAD is also focused on corruption. And if you look at our country, since it's founded in 1957, corruption has been one of the major impediments to our development. And we have tried many institutional forms to fight corruption, but so far we seem not to have succeeded. I'll be very brief. Historically, we attempted using just the police to fight corruption. In the 60s, we realized that that wasn't working because there was total lack of faith in the police service. And we passed a law called the Corruption Prevention Act. What we did under this law was essentially to use the mechanism of a commission of inquiry to investigate corruption. So either allegations of corruption, we have a commission of inquiry investigating the corruption, and then when they make their findings, those findings become a prima facie case, and you, the person who has those findings against, would then have to defend yourself in a court of law. This was an institutional mechanism we used to avoid having to use the police in investigation. Under the 1969 Constitution, we brought in the Ombudsman, which has now become SHRAD, both under the 1982 Constitution. So this attempt, this institutional form of the Office of the Special Prosecutor being used to fight corruption, I think is innovative and is in line with the obligation of the government, of the state, to eradicate corruption and not just to fight, to deal with corruption when acts of corruption have already taken taking place. And some lawyers nowadays, we tend to focus more on preventative lawyering. We don't do curative lawyering. Our focus is trying to prevent a legal breach from taking place, with legal consequences following.
That's right.
Instead of waiting for something to happen before we try to find a legal solution. Now, having said that, now the call by civil society for investigation and prosecution is opposite. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually in line with the constitutional obligation of all citizens, including civil society, to fight towards the eradication of corruption. But in order to appreciate this call, I think it is important, perhaps, I try to maybe highlight what I consider to be the key findings of this report. I must say, Honorable Masanamidu has a style of writing, which reminds me of the English judge of Diplock, where there's use of very compound and complex sentences. So it takes quite a bit of effort to sometimes understand exactly the point that is being. Perhaps if there was an executive summary with the key findings of the big, it would have helped a lot. But in very simple terms, I see this report to be raising essentially four main things. One is about the processes leading to the approval of the Agyapa deal. It is clear that certain organizations or certain companies that initially were not part of the process were included subsequently. Now, the second major finding that I see from this report is that there appear to be certain clear breaches of constitutional provisions and statutory provisions. Masanamidu talks about Article 1815. That some of the transactions, in fact, are international business transactions and by constitutional imperative should have been approved by Parliament. They don't seem to have been approved by Parliament. He also talks about statutory breaches, possible breaches of Public Procurement Act as well as the Public Financial Management Act, and then talks about bid rigging and all. Now, what is the legal status of this report? I think we need to understand that this report is not making definitive findings of wrongdoing. That is not the focus and purpose of this report. Its purpose essentially is to do an assessment and bring out possible areas that could be prone to corruption or could lead to corrupt acts being committed, right? So I think the call by civil society and also by the NDC for prosecution, for investigation and prosecution is in order, because it seems to me a careful reading of this report indicates that at least parts of the findings pass a smell test, in the sense that they appear to give a very reasonable basis or probable cause for further investigation. So, for example, if our money has already been paid to Imara and all, and it appears there was something wrong with the procurement process, then definitely we should be interested in finding out exactly what happened and establishing conclusively whether or not there have been breaches, and if so, what the consequences of the breaches should be. If the purpose is for prevention by way of curative, what's the point of further investigations and prosecution? And do I understand further investigation and prosecution to mean that this report cannot be used to prosecute? No, I don't get the sense that this report can be used to prosecute, definitely. Before you can use a report to prosecute, usually the investigating process for prosecution requires certain processes. For example, the suspects have to be given the chance to respond to whatever allegations against them. If after the investigation you feel that there's a case for them to answer, you have to caution them, where you tell them that you are charging them with this offense, if you keep quiet or rely on their previous statements and all. So this report doesn't partake of any of those processes. But to answer your question directly about whether or not this report should be used as a base for further prosecution, I think doing so is consistent with the functions of the Office of the Special Prosecutor. Now, when you look at Section 3 of the Office of Special Prosecutor Act, it is very, very clear that the role or the mandate of the office includes investigating and prosecuting. Investigating and prosecuting. Because, what would be the purpose of doing a corruption risk assessment if what we do is as we did in the past. The report just gathers that. So once there is a basis, once there is a probable cause, once there is some evidence that suggests that a certain illegality may well have been committed, I think the call for a further investigation and prosecution is in order. I don't agree with this view that because this is a very novel mechanism that we have instituted, it might complicate further our fight against corruption if we use this report as a basis for further investigation and prosecution. I don't think so. I think it will be in line with the object of the mandate of the Office of Special Prosecutor Act, as well as Article 35(8), which calls on the state to take steps to eradicate corruption.
So he says something at the very end on page 64, which confirms what you have just, your preamble to my question, which is what you said, which constitutes, if you like, the summary of the fundamentals of criminal jurisprudence. You cannot seek to prosecute a person if you have not taken them through a prosecutorial investigations, you have not cautioned them, and also to put them on alert so that they will not self-incriminate and they will exercise their rights in Articles 14, Article 19, and so on and so forth. He says this assessment does not constitute an investigation, even though formal investigations for the suspected commission of corruption and corruption-related offenses may arise from this corruption risk assessment. It is not the work of a commission or committee of inquiry. Of course, we know that you cannot use the work of a commission or committee of inquiry to prosecute. You need fresh investigations. It is what it is, an analysis of the risk of corruption, an anti-corruption assessment of the transaction documents. It partakes in the nature of a compliance audit. Compliance audit. So if the purpose is a compliance audit, do you think that being in a hurry to call for investigation and prosecution will help what we seek to chart for the future? That we should not be going after corruption after it has occurred and so on, but we should seek to prevent it. And in seeking to prevent it, we should do a risk assessment where people should voluntarily give documents and cooperate. If at the back of my mind, I am thinking this assessment you are seeking to do, you may seek through it to prosecute me. Do you think we can achieve anything if we look at it this way, rather than a curative process, then we turn it into a process for prosecution?
Something I appreciate perhaps about the chilling effect of any calls for further investigation in having on the fight against corruption. But sometimes when you look at our history, corruption has been one of the main stumbling blocks to our national development. And whatever it is that we have to do to address corruption, I think we need to do that, even if some persons might be uncomfortable with some of the steps that we have to take. As I've indicated, one of the main functions of the Office of the Special Prosecutor is investigating and prosecuting corruption and corruption-related offenses. And I think doing further investigation, and if there is a basis for prosecution, mounting a prosecution would be one of the boldest steps that we could take to give effect to the policy rationale for the establishment of the Office of the Special Prosecutor, in addition to complying with our constitutional imperatives.
Right.
We need to be, public officials sometimes always want to be given a certain unbounded discretion, often on the basis that it is true that they will be able to serve the public best. But our experience doesn't show that giving them such untrammeled, uncontrolled discretion has been in our best interest. And in this regard, let me just add on also to the point made by Professor PREMPEH about the need for us to streamline, to mainstream and make this anti-corruption audit part of perhaps our procurement process and part of any transactions that the government partakes in. And I think we can do this pretty simply. All we need to do is to come out with a comprehensive corruption risk assessment framework, as they have done in some countries. All you do is just come out with a checklist, like a checklist of about 100. So any transaction, you go through the checklist. Is it a foreign partner? Who are the shareholders? You check. Do they have a relevant experience? You check. This is something that could be done in a very simple, productive manner to check corruption. So I really think, to sum up my main submission on this, I really think that yes, the report doesn't make definitive findings of wrongdoing. It is just, as he puts it, a compliance audit. But I think there is enough information from that report that suggests possible breaches of constitutional provisions and also breaches of criminal statutes. And I think that the call for further investigation and, if need be, prosecution is justified. All
right. Dr. Bassett, we will let you hold on there. We will take a quick break. When we return, the special prosecutor says John Mahama is government official 1 in the Airbus scandal. Question remains, and so what? Is that the end of the story? And is the special prosecutor ready to admit, like some have suggested, that in some part he did a sloppy job, where he requires that the mandate agreement required, or transaction advisors thing required, the prior approval of Parliament? Was he right or wrong? We will show you why he may have been wrong. We'll be right back.